All right. Well, we still have people filing in, but I have a number of announcements to say before we go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and say what I need to say. Good evening, everyone. And I would like to welcome all of you to the Hudson Library's virtual author event with Chris Miller. And we will be getting started with that in just a few moments. Now, if you regularly attend our programs, I'm sure you know we have a full schedule, but tonight's virtual event is just one of our many upcoming events. In fact, on Tuesday, November 1st, we welcome Pulitzer Prize winning biographer John Meacham, who will talk about his new book, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle. We'll also have journalist Bradley Hope, who will be discussing North Korean politics, and the activist currently on the run, Adrian Hong, on November 3rd with myself. We'll also have the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Tristan Hunt, on November 7th to discuss the life of the famous potter, Josiah Wedgwood. In addition to all of this, November is also our celebration of all things entrepreneurship. So make sure you check our calendar at hudsonlibrary.org for everything, details, and links to register. Now, copies of Chris's book, Chip War, are available for purchase, courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookshop, The Learned Owl. We'll put a link in the chat for easy purchase. We're also going to have plenty of time for questions tonight. So leave any question you have regarding chips, the semiconductor industry, the future of it, whatever you want in the Q&A box down below, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Chris Miller is an associate professor of international history at Tufts University, and his writing has been published in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He is the Jean Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Miller writes frequently on Russian foreign policy, domestic politics, economic policy, and has been featured on CNBC and NPR. So now I'd like to welcome Chris. Chris, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and give the platform to you. And when you're ready for questions, just let me know and I'll come back.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kelsey, and to the entire Hudson Library team for the invitation to speak to you all this evening. It's an honor to be featured here, especially alongside so many of the other distinguished authors that you mentioned, Kelsey, will be speaking later this fall. And I'm excited to share with you some of the conclusions from my new book, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. Now, you may not often think that much about semiconductors, but semiconductors do a lot of thinking for you. If you're a typical person, you rely on semiconductors in almost all parts of your daily life. A semiconductor, or a computer chip, as it's more commonly known, is certainly found inside of computers and in smartphones, but today almost anything with an on-off switch has a chip inside. Your car, for example, will have dozens or in some cases hundreds of semiconductors inside. Your dishwasher, your microwave, all sorts of appliances rely on semiconductors. So it isn't just advanced computing that requires semiconductors to function today, but indeed most of the most advanced semiconductors today are used inside of devices that require sophisticated computing. PCs, for example, have multiple semiconductors inside. Smartphones have more than that, semiconductors that manage the software, semiconductors that operate as memory chips, semiconductors that manage the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi, the connection with the cell phone network, semiconductors that manage the camera, the audio. Smartphones simply can't work without semiconductors. The same thing is true of the internet and the cloud, where we store all of our data today. The cloud is simply a bunch of warehouses full of semiconductors, memory chips, processor chips, AI accelerators. All of these are semiconductors that are carved into silicon, and we could not have the digital world as we know it without them. Now, when I began this book, I was far from an expert in computing technologies. I started writing this book as a history of missile guidance systems during the Cold War. And the question I wanted to ask, and I'm a historian of Russia by training, which explains my interest in this topic, was why was it that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States could both make nuclear weapons in large quantities? The Soviet Union and the United States could both shoot both satellites and then later people into space. but only the United States among the two superpowers could miniaturize computing power in a way that fit into missile systems, which was one of the key technologies of the latter half of the Cold War, as we saw the revolution in precision military systems that today defines military power. And the more I learned about the guidance computers inside of missiles, the more I realized that the challenge of miniaturizing computing power wasn't simply a challenge for militaries. It was, in fact, the biggest manufacturing problem of the past 75 years. Now, today we take miniaturized computing for granted. We barely think when we flip on our smartphone and are able to access the internet or take photos and send them across the world. But it wasn't so long ago when computing was rare and expensive. In 1945, the most advanced computer of the day, the ENIAC computer at the University of Pennsylvania, had just several tens of thousands of vacuum tubes, each a light bulb-like device that could turn on or off, creating a 1 or a 0, whether it was on or off. And these ones or zeros produced all the digits that undergird all digital computing. Now, vacuum tubes were inefficient. They required lots of energy. They were large and hard to miniaturize. And so computers with tens of thousands of vacuum tubes had to take up an entire room and required regular repair and replacement. In 1947, to replace the vacuum tube, a device called the transistor was created, a small electronic switch that again turns on and off, creating ones and zeros undergirding all computing. In 1958, the first transistor was etched inside of a single piece of silicon, creating the first silicon chip. And since that point, the computer industry has advanced, and all technology, I would argue, has advanced because we've learned to miniaturize transistors in a way that was inconceivable at the time the first transistors were made. So today, if you take out an advanced smartphone out of your pocket and open it up, the main chip inside of that smartphone will have 15 billion transistors inside of it. Compare that to the 1945 ENIAC computer, which had several tens of thousands of vacuum tubes that were able to turn on and off. And because your phone has 15 billion or so transistors inside of it, it can produce, process, remember 15 billions ones and zeros simultaneously. So the software that it can run is much more complex. The data that it can manage can be much more sophisticated. And this process of miniaturizing computing power, miniaturizing the tiny transistor switches so that we can fit more devices that create ones and zeros on pieces of silicon has been the greatest manufacturing challenge of the last 75 years. When the first chips were created, transistors were so big they were visible. You could see a transistor with your eyes. Today, transistors are so small, and they've got to be tiny to fit 15 billion of them on a single piece of silicon inside of your phone, that each one of them is roughly the size of a coronavirus, actually slightly smaller than a coronavirus in their most advanced forms. And so the challenge of manufacturing transistors by the many billions with almost perfect accuracy at nanometer scale, nanometers being 1/1000th of a meter, has been an extraordinary challenge for the chip industry. Now, we often think of technology as being about software or the internet or computers, but actually technology and computing power have only progressed forward because our ability to manufacture transistors has gotten better and better and more precise over time. The key challenge in producing computing power is having devices that can manufacture at nanometer scale with near perfect accuracy. And today, doing so requires acquiring and using machinery from just a small number of companies that have the knowledge and skill to produce machinery that can undertake these types of actions. Today, there are 5 companies that dominate the market to produce the machines without which advanced chips can't be made. 3 based in California, 1 in the Netherlands, and 1 in Japan. And these machines are among the most complex machines ever invented in human history. Just to give you one example of what this machinery looks like, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machine produced by the Dutch company ASML, which is a machine without which it's simply impossible to make advanced chips, costs $150 million a piece. And these machines are so expensive because inside of them, there is there's a regular explosion happening at millions of times a second, creating a several 100,000-degree hot plasma that emits light just at the right wavelength to be collected by the flattest mirrors ever produced by humans, and then directed towards a chip. And then this carves patterns in the chip. So the engineering required to have several 100,000-degree explosions happening on a near constant basis and produce the flattest mirrors ever made by humans has been extraordinarily difficult, which is why this particular machine took over 3 decades to produce and is so brutally expensive to make and to acquire. And this machine is one of the most extreme examples of the complexity of the manufacturing equipment involved, but it's far from unique. At every stage of the semiconductor manufacturing process, the equipment needed is extraordinarily complex, difficult to manage, and expensive. And because this machine tooling is so complicated to make, a small number of companies, as I mentioned, control its production. And because this production happens largely in 3 countries, Japan, the US, and the Netherlands, this produces a not only a economically valuable position within the industry, but also a politically relevant position, because just a couple of countries have the ability to turn off other countries' access to the production of advanced computing power. Now, it's not anyone who can take the machines produced by these companies, and make an advanced chip. And indeed, there's only a couple of companies in the world that acquire this machinery and are able to produce chips at an advanced level. Today, 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips are made by a company called TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which produces almost all of its chips on the island of Taiwan. Taiwan is the world's most important country when it comes to the actual manufacturing of chips. In addition to producing 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips, Taiwan also produces over 1/3 of all of the world's processor chips, advanced and less advanced. In other words, 1/3 of the computing power that we add each year globally comes from Taiwan. Now, the semiconductor industry has been in the news a fair amount over the past couple of years because of the semiconductor shortage that emerged in 2020 and 2021 following the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, there was a shortage that caused vast disruptions across the global economy, an estimated $200 billion in damage to the global auto industry alone, as car companies were unable to source the semiconductors they need for their cars. But in fact, in 2020 and 2021, the supply of chips actually increased. The problem was that demand grew faster. In 2020, the world produced 8% more chips than it had in 2019. In 2021, the supply of chips grew at a double-digit rate, even faster, but demand outstripped supply, driven by a desire to buy new smartphones, new personal computers, and a massive expansion in the number of data centers and the sophistication of data centers, which require very advanced chips. And because of this, because demand outstripped supply, we had a major shortage that caused immense problems across the world economy. Today, the semiconductor shortages of the past 2 years have begun to be addressed as supply has begun to catch up to demand, and as demand has cooled after the pandemic. But there are new risks on the horizon for the semiconductor industry. And the fact that the world's most advanced processor chips are largely made in Taiwan, even as Taiwan is increasingly the target of the Chinese government's desire to reassert control over that island, adds a new level of complexity and, I would argue, of risk to not only the chip industry, but to the entire global economy that depends on semiconductors. Since 2014, the Chinese government has been pouring tens of billions of dollars a year into the development of its own domestic chip industry. But the Chinese government is still heavily reliant on imported semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment from abroad. Today, China spends about as much money importing chips as it spends importing oil. And if China wants to make semiconductors, it can only do so by using tools, manufacturing equipment, and software from the United States, Japan, the Netherlands, and other countries. In other words, China's entire tech industry is completely reliant on the import of tools from its geopolitical rivals, a situation that has left China's government deeply concerned over the past couple of years about its ability to continue providing the computing power on which the Chinese economy relies. Meanwhile, though, the Chinese military has been dramatically expanding over the past couple of years, and the military balance in the Taiwan Straits has shifted quite substantially. If you compare, for example, to several decades ago, the Chinese military has far more systems in and around the Taiwan Straits and far more sophisticated systems as a result, whereas the US military has only marginally increased its positioning in the Indo-Pacific region compared to a decade ago. And so the military balance has shifted dramatically towards China, even as China has been trying to develop its own semiconductor industry domestically, but still finds itself quite reliant on the rest of the world, and in particular, like everyone else, on production in Taiwan, because like the rest of the world, China is no less dependent on Taiwanese production as anyone else. Now, to deal with the shifting military balance and the deterioration of US military power relative to China's in the Pacific, the United States government has recently begun rolling out a new set of controls designed to limit China's ability to access the types of tools needed to produce advanced computing power. And the US strategy is quite simple. The US believes that China will almost certainly produce more military equipment than the US. It already is doing so today. It will do so over the coming decade: more ships, more planes, more drones, more missiles. And so the only hope that the United States has to compete, Pentagon officials believe, is to have more quality systems to compete with the quantity fielded by the People's Liberation Army. And the US has concluded that the primary edge it has when it comes to quality of military systems is computing power, because the US and its allies control the production of advanced computing, control the production of advanced semiconductors, whereas China is today almost wholly reliant on imported systems and imported chips from abroad. Earlier this month, the Biden administration rolled out a series of quite strict controls banning the import to China of advanced chips that make possible AI algorithms in data centers, and also restricting the transfer of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to prevent China's domestic chip industry from making progress towards the cutting edge. And the goal is to call a halt to China's progress in AI and in high performance computing, and make China reliant on importing high performance computing capabilities from abroad, or in many cases just cutting them off entirely. And the Biden administration was quite clear about its goal. The goal was to stop China's advances and to grow the gap in computing between US and Chinese capabilities, with the hope that a growing gap between US and Chinese capabilities would enable US military systems to keep their qualitative edge despite China's quantitative buildup. But of course, this comes at a dangerous time because for now, the military balance is continuing to shift in China's direction. And China realizes that it faces an immense difficulty in trying to domesticate semiconductor technology. It's still deeply reliant on software and tools imported from abroad. And it now finds itself having to import high performance chips from a province that in China's view is its own territory. Now, of course, the United States and Taiwan take a different view and are committed to retaining the autonomy of Taiwan. But from the perspective of China, it finds itself dependent on what it believes to be a rogue province for all of the computing, all of the advanced computing at least, that it needs. And so Taiwan sits at the center of a very dangerous dispute, a dispute not only geopolitical or military in terms, this was highlighted by Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island in August, but also a dispute that is fundamentally intertwined with all of our advanced technology, because Taiwan's importance today isn't simply that it is the most likely site for a potential war between China and its neighbors. It's also the beating heart of the digital world, the island that produces the bulk of the advanced computing that we rely on. And if there were an emergency in the Taiwan Straits, or a Chinese blockade or attack on Taiwan, the impact on the world economy would be dramatic, and the loss of the computing power that China that Taiwan rather produces would be enough to plunge the world economy into a deep and severe recession. So I titled my book Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, with this horrifying scenario in mind. There's, of course, a battle between engineers to produce the most advanced technology. There's a struggle between companies to devise the most effective business models and produce the best products. But there's also a deep interconnection between semiconductors and military power, a relationship that existed in the earliest days of the semiconductor industry when semiconductors were used for guidance computers on missiles, but persists to this day as the world's most advanced semiconductors are produced on the island that is most likely to be a military flashpoint between the US and China in the future. So I will stop there, having put those ideas on the table, and turn the floor back to you, Kelsey, and happy to answer any questions that the audience has.
Absolutely. I'm sure we're going to get some questions. And I have a question for you before we go ahead and start taking audience questions. I want to talk about President Joe Biden's CHIPS Act that he just passed in August. Now, your book is really detailed, and I know you can't make this a 30-minute summary. The amount of players and people that were involved, especially in early Silicon Valley, that really made a difference, and also about like how the United States was really the birthplace of the semiconductor chip, and then it kind of expanded across the world. But with the CHIPS Act, with money going in to support, especially three players, I believe it's going to be mostly Intel, Texas Instruments, and the third one, I forget.
Wait, yeah, go ahead.
But with money mostly going to support them to create an area for them to build and produce chips here on American soil in an effort to really bolster our supply. Is that really going to work? Because in your book, you talk about government intervention before with chips. And two, even if it does work, how long would that actually take for us to actually have a safe, secure supply?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and it's a hard question, I think, to answer. So the government has allocated $39 billion via the Chips and Science Act to subsidize the production of manufacturing facilities in the US. And the logic behind it is that it's cheaper to build semiconductor manufacturing facilities abroad, largely in East Asia, primarily because government policy in those countries makes it cheaper. So those countries have tax policies and subsidy programs that make it cheaper. So the goal is to level the playing field, if you will, by providing a comparable set of incentives in the US. The challenge is that $39 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it doesn't actually get you that far when it comes to semiconductors, because one new advanced semiconductor production facility can cost $20 billion. So if you're subsidizing, let's say 20% of the cost of a facility, you can only build a handful of facilities before you burn through your money. And that's $39 billion over a handful of years. So the annual sum is not actually that large. I think it's pretty clear that this money will have an effect in encouraging the production of new facilities in the US. And we've already seen a number of announcements from companies that are planning new facilities, both US companies, but also foreign companies that are opening new facilities in the US, including Taiwan's TSMC. But the challenge is that the actual volume won't be big enough to make a huge difference. It will make a difference. But the reality is that Taiwan will be the center of the world's chipmaking industry in 5 years' time, regardless. Now, most of the facilities that are going to be subsidized by this legislation will be online in, I would guess, 3 or 4 years. So there's a fair amount of time it takes to produce them. But the real challenge in terms of reducing dependence on geopolitical hotspots in East Asia is not so much the timeline, it's just that the amount of money one would need to spend to incentivize enough production to shift to meaningfully reduce our reliance in East Asia is dramatic, far larger than the $39 billion in incentives that we've already allocated. So it's largely a cost issue that makes it so difficult, and that's why production will likely remain focused in Taiwan in particular.
Makes sense. It's been a talk here in Ohio, obviously, because Intel announced they will be opening a plant a little bit north of Columbus. So even though we're in Northeast Ohio here, it's driving distance. There are a lot of people talking about it. Do we have any idea, like, I know it's rough, but maybe you're more following the industry, like how many facilities this will probably allow to be opened across the country?
I think at least a dozen, and perhaps somewhat more than that. It's not going to be a huge number of facilities because
Right.
these facilities themselves are A, very expensive, and B, you don't want a lot of facilities. You want a small number of very large facilities because you need big facilities with high volume to be efficient enough to be cost effective. So
Right.
actually, I'd rather see fewer facilities at larger scale than a large number of facilities.
Your book does talk about that a lot too, was that with chips, the importance of scale is really the most important thing. You have to be able to produce so much so quickly. And another thing, when you were talking, you said 150 billion, right? To create the machine that actually makes the chips. So I'm questioning, how quickly does the technology that makes the machines, how quickly is that also being updated as new chips and new chip technology is coming out?
Yeah, so the machine tools have to be updated on a regular basis as well. And depending on which type of machine you're looking at, generally every couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years, we'll see a new generation of machine tool emerge as well, because as transistors are made smaller and smaller and smaller, the machines must be more and more and more precise to um, actually carve these transistors into silicon. And so we require not only advances in designing transistors so they can become smaller, not only advances in manufacturing them, but also advances in the tooling that makes manufacturing possible. And only when all of the industry works together on the same timeline do we get the advances that we need.
Right. And then I one last question before we turn it to the audience. We have some great questions coming in. I'm just curious about market share because other than us choking China out from, we don't allow them to make advanced chips. They have very basic chips they're allowed to make though, correct?
Correct.
Still, okay, but they can't make anything advanced. So everyone who's making advanced at this point in time is a United States ally, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. So
Correct.
my point is if we are wanting to make and produce more and have a greater market share, this would be though at the cost of one of our allies losing market share, correct?
That's right. That's right.
And would there
And that,
be political implications because we're talking about such power at this point, right? Is there any opportunity this could have political implications and can actually maybe cause a rift in geopolitical relations because of what's on the line?
yeah, that's absolutely a great observation, Kelsey. I think we're already seeing that to some extent. Certainly, no one wants to surrender their market share, whether companies or countries. And the fact that the U.S. is pushing for more fabrication of chips onshore does mean that either we have overcapacity and we have too many facilities worldwide, or someone gets fewer facilities and we get more. Now, I think the reality is that because the Chips and Science Act is going to have an impact, but not a huge impact, that actually the effect of the market share question is actually not huge because the Chips and Science Act is going to move the needle, but slightly. So it's a manageable process to negotiate that with the Koreans and the Taiwanese and others. The big challenge is really with China. And for two reasons. First off, because if you look at what the Chips and Science Act is going to fund, it's primarily going to be the most advanced type of fabs facilities, which is an area where we know we're going to need more capacity globally. So there won't be a risk of overcapacity, I don't think, in the most cutting edge types of chips. But what the Chinese government is funding, because they can't access the machines you need to produce the most cutting edge chips, they're pouring money into production of less cutting edge chips. And that's the type of chips that many countries can produce. And indeed, other countries, less so the US, but other countries are also launching their own government subsidy programs, smaller than China's, but nevertheless significant. So there's a real risk of overcapacity induced largely by China's government subsidies in the market for less advanced chips. And that's good news if you're a buyer of less advanced chips, but it's bad news if you're a producer of them. And so I think one of the issues that will have to be dealt with over the coming years is what approach do we take to the market for less advanced chips? How do we accept the fact that China is going to pour subsidies in and drive down profitability of existing companies, or do we impose some sort of limits on that? I think that will be a complicated issue for political leaders in the U.S., but also in allied countries to deal with.
A very complicated issue, you're correct. So we'll turn now to some audience questions. We already have some coming in. Feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A box. George has a really good question. George simply wants to know, how did Taiwan become the most important center for the construction of the advanced semiconductors?
Well, it's a mix of planning and of luck. The planning was that the Taiwanese government identified the electronics industry as early as the 1960s as a growth market and did everything they could to attract companies to invest in Taiwan and set up electronics assembly facilities. That's the planning. The luck was that in 1987, the Taiwanese had hired an American semiconductor executive named Morris Chang, who'd spent most of his career at Texas Instruments, but was passed over for the job of CEO and was looking for something new to do. And so the Taiwanese hired him and convinced him to come to Taiwan and start up a new company. And Morris Chang, who's still around today, he's in his early 90s right now, founded TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, with a brand new business model that rather than trying to both design and manufacture chips in-house, TSMC decided, Morris Chang decided, he would just manufacture chips for any company that designed them. So you could design chips, take your design to Morris Chang's company, and he would manufacture them for you. And that was a good deal because manufacturing was hard, it was expensive, and there were huge economies of scale. So he could do it more efficiently, more cheaply if he had lots of customers and was manufacturing for all of them. And so Taiwan was in some ways just quite lucky to have hired him. And he brought this business idea to Taiwan as a result of that. And TSMC has been the key driver of Taiwan's growth. Most of the chips that Taiwan sells today are produced by TSMC, and all of the advanced chips that Taiwan sells are produced by TSMC. And TSMC could had history worked out differently, stood for the Texas Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, since Morris Chang had spent most of his career in Texas at Texas Instruments. But the fact that there was no U.S. firm or that was looking to adopt that business model, coupled with the fact that Taiwan was a mix of smart and lucky in hiring him, that explains why they've managed to grow so dramatically over the past couple of decades.
And plus, way back, we go way back in the history of the chips too. The earliest chips manufactured here in the United States, they had tons of flaws in them, if I'm correct. The error rate on the chips was astronomical. So you were going to have a lot of waste of potential parts that just were not working. Whereas when the chip manufacturing took place overseas, they had a higher, if I remember, a really, really much higher rate of accuracy in the chips.
That's right. One of the key challenges in chip making is getting your accuracy rate as high as possible. In the industry, that's called your yield, the percentage of chips that actually work as intended. And Morris Chang was, compared to anyone else in the industry, had a reputation for having the highest yield in his manufacturing lines from the late 1950s all the way up to the present. And U.S. firms have generally been better at innovating new types of chips, at devising new business models around them, but they've often had more difficulty in the quality control and precision manufacturing side of things. And so in a number of key transition points, U.S. firms have struggled with this question of yield relative to competitors elsewhere.
So I have a random question, because we're talking about the chip manufacturing process, but I would like to know more about the chip creation process. So who comes up with the idea of the chip layouts and then how they're molded and sent? Can you give a little bit of a breakdown of how a chip goes from like point A of ideation to the end?
Well, today it's a very complicated process because chips are so complicated. So if you imagine a chip with 10 billion transistors, it's not the case that you've got a team of people laying them out by hand, although the earliest chips were laid out by hand. Now there are complex software tools that let you lay out where each transistor should go on a chip. And so rather than saying this transistor goes here, this one goes there, you can use the software to say, I want a certain capability, and then it will lay out transistors in a way that creates that capability on a chip. That's a vast oversimplification, but that's basically how the process works. And so as a result of that, you first think, what capability do I want my chip to do? And many parts of that capability you can actually buy off the shelf by using intellectual property from other companies. So most chips will have, or many chips will have intellectual property where a chunk of the chip is actually bought from an outside firm, because if someone else has already done the work, there's no point repeating it. So in a given chip, you'll have certain of the layouts will be from other companies, and you'll try to think, well, what are the new things I want my chip to do? What are the features that I know I need, but I know someone else has already designed, and bring them together in a way that produces the chip that you need. So today, any given chip will have multiple companies involved in most cases in the actual design process, because there's portions of the chip design that are licensed from other companies.
Makes sense. Now you're talking about the advanced chips. Now, advanced chips, obviously, our most advanced chips are the ones that are used in military weapons. But are the ones in our cars, our smart fridges, are those also considered advanced chips as well?
Well, actually, it's a common assumption that the most advanced chips are in military systems, but that's actually not true. The most advanced chips are in your iPhone, and in data centers that you access every day, not thinking about it, that are owned by Amazon or Google, and in new PCs, if you buy a new PC. The military is doing its best to access the most advanced chips, but if you think about defense systems like fighter jets, they have lifespans of decades, whereas smartphones have lifespans of years. And there's a new smartphone model, an Apple 13 followed by an Apple 14. I'm sure there'll be an Apple 15, an iPhone 15 next every year, basically. And so what that means is that every year there's a new and more powerful chip inside of each iPhone, and the same thing is true for PCs and for data centers. Whereas the military, the U.S. military and all militaries actually struggle to keep up with that rate of rapid product cycles. So for most people, the chip in the main chip in the smartphone in their pocket will be as powerful, in many cases, most cases, more powerful, more advanced than what you'd find in a typical military system, which is interesting and complicated because the military obviously like to have the most advanced computing, and so it finds itself increasingly turning to commercial chips to put in military systems. And that is increasingly problematic or challenging because the most advanced chips are produced in other countries, adding to the complexity of the issue of securing supply chains.
That makes sense. This is a really interesting question, but it's very topical. Obviously, we know that last weekend, President Xi Jinping completely pretty much took over full control of the Chinese government as a third term in his presidency. Is there any strategy to protect all that investment in facilities in Taiwan in case China tries to take back Taiwan? Especially because you're talking about how they've been really building up their military. We know that, pre-pandemic, they did with Hong Kong. So we are aware that this is a possibility. Many economists and people have been already pretty much saying it's going to happen, but it's more like when. What role do you think the United States has, or anything in general, in terms of trying to support Taiwan for, if China decides to come and get the chips?
Well, this is indeed the challenge. The U.S. has pledged somewhat ambiguously, but pledged through congressional legislation to help defend Taiwan. The reality, however, is that it's gotten harder and harder for the U.S. to make that pledge credible, because U.S. military power relative to Chinese military power over the past several decades has declined dramatically. If you think back to the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1995 and 1996, when the Chinese government threatened Taiwan and shot missiles over Taiwan, Bill Clinton, who was president then, ordered a U.S. aircraft carrier to sail through the Taiwan Straits. Today, that would not happen, I don't think, because the risk posed to U.S. Naval ships, for example, from China's anti-ship missiles is vastly higher than it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago. The question now is not, can the U.S. surface fleet operate in the Taiwan Strait, it cannot operate anywhere in the Western Pacific without being at risk of Chinese targeting. And if you look at the Pentagon's public reports about Chinese military power, what you'll find is a fairly open assessment of the fact that they're increasingly hemmed in by China's advances and by the expansion of China's capabilities. So, is there a strategy? Well, I'm not sure I would say that there's a great strategy. The reality is that we retain our stated pledge to help Taiwan defend itself, but the reality is we're less capable of doing so today than at any point in the past several decades.
Okay. With that in mind, so it really does make it a very dangerous situation where you have one location, and essentially an entire planet that is holding so much of the world's population in terms of technology, progress moving forward, and necessary equipment supplies, right? From our cars to our phones to whatever. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's a highly dangerous situation. I think most people have no idea the extent to which the entire world economy depends on one company and one island. And right now, neither the U.S. nor any other country has a plan as to what to do about the situation. But the reality is that the likelihood of war between China and Taiwan is increasing, I think. If you look at the shift in military balance, look at the dramatic shift in domestic politics in China, look at the fact that in the Party Congress last weekend in Beijing, party leaders again reiterated their commitment to asserting control of the island by peaceful means or not. I mean, all of this, I think, suggests that I don't think a Chinese attack is guaranteed, or even maybe it's not even the most likely outcome, but certainly it's a lot more likely than it would have been 10 years ago. And over the last 10 years, even as the risk of war has become more likely, our reliance on Taiwan to produce advanced chips has become more likely as well. So in hindsight, this was I think, strategic error to let both of these trends happen simultaneously.
Yeah. Joe in the audience has a good question. He was interested to know what bearing does the war in Ukraine and its outcomes have on the global chip war? Is there a role to play? Obviously, Russia was a direct competitor in the chips with us during the Cold War, but modern today, does that have any bearing?
Not much actually. Neither Russia nor Ukraine plays much of a role at all in the production of semiconductors. Russia has a really small and technologically backward chip industry that almost exclusively serves its domestic defense industry, its military industrial complex. Ukraine has hardly any. So the war has really not had much impact at all on the semiconductor industry.
So we've talked about it, and you talk about a lot in your book, the various choke points about how you can really control the demand, like the supply of the chips based on only these countries make them, only these countries manufacture the equipment. I want to know more about where the actual material for the chips come from. Are there any stockade, countries that really have the stockade of the materials that are used for the semiconductor chips, and that also gives them a level of power in this arena?
Yes, there are. The key challenge for materials for chip making is not necessarily acquiring the materials, but acquiring them at a level of purity and chemical stability needed for the precision in chip making. So the question is not who's got the silicon. Silicon is actually one of the most widely dispersed elements in the Earth's crust. It's who's got the ability to purify it to the proper level and to make sure that it's produced into wafers with the requisite level of impurities, close to none. And the silicon wafer process is actually relatively easy compared to a lot of the more specialized chemicals that are used in the chip making process. Japanese firms play a big role in this type of specialized chemicals. There's also a number of firms in the US and Europe as well that play major roles. But it's, again, basically the US, Japan, Europe, those are basically the three big players in the chemicals and raw material processing of chip making.
Right. And as you're saying, we have so many chips within one chip on our phones or whatever. And I'm thinking of how prevalent e-waste is nowadays. So You know, if I open a drawer, I have at least 10 cell phones since I was in college that I still have not disposed of, and they're just sitting there. How recyclable is the material that is in the actual semiconductor chips when they are taken to an e-waste facility or anything like that? Can those be repurposed, or is that adding to, you know, our global footprint?
I'm not aware of any way that they can be easily repurposed. But I think, yeah, I don't think there's any sort of effective recycling.
Oh boy. Okay. Um, we have another interesting question from CJ. It's a little long, so I'm gonna try and read this clearly. CJ says, we see Biden's administration has recently restricted US citizens working for chip industries in China. Both the industry and government may restrict ethnic Chinese working for certain key positions within the US for the fear they may leak technology to China. This may harm the companies and individuals for some wasted talent. CJ would like to know how the US government and companies may deal with it, both legally and morally.
Well, I would say there are two different issues here, CJ. First is on the question of restrictions of U.S. persons, which is a legal question, which means both U.S. companies and U.S. citizens dealing with firms in China. And so this is not this is nothing to do with ethnicity. This is about any sort of U.S. person, whether working for relevant Chinese companies, but also selling to, providing services for, any sort of fixing machines inside. So any of the Chinese companies that is listed by the government, U.S. persons are not allowed to work for. And so it's the same sort of rule that you get vis-a-vis companies in Iran or North Korea. That once they're blacklisted, Americans can't do business with them. So that's the new rule that's happened. On the question of people of ethnic Chinese background in the chip industry, I mean, I think actually the U.S. chip industry has lots of examples, both historically and today, of Americans of Chinese or Taiwanese descent or Southeast Asian Chinese descent, and obviously the identities are complex, playing major roles in the industry. So if you look, for example, Lisa Su, the CEO of AMD, is of Taiwanese descent. Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA, is a Taiwanese American. So I think this is an industry actually where you've seen Chinese and Taiwanese Americans playing huge roles. And I mentioned Morris Chang earlier. Morris Chang has had a career and a life that has spanned both sides of the Pacific. He was born in mainland China, fled the revolution, enrolled at Harvard, then MIT, and then went to Taiwan afterwards, not because of any sort of family ties or ties to nationality, but because he was approached to run a business there. So kind of an interesting example of this sort of cross-Pacific ties. So I think I think actually the chip industry is sort of a great example of an industry where there's lots of great examples of Chinese and Taiwanese American people playing leading roles in the industry, both in terms of the science, but also in terms of the business.
Fantastic. So I do have a question for you because I know you did a ton of research in this book. The amount of footnotes and endnotes in the back is quite impressive. So I know you are probably following because, as you said, most people are very unaware of the chips and the situation we have. So if someone, after listening to today's lecture, would like to continue reading more about semiconductors or keeping up with the most current news, do you have any recommendations for any journalists or people that are closely following the semiconductor industry that you would recommend we follow?
Well, if you want to get in the nitty gritty, I would say there's a couple of websites online that have great, that are sort of clearinghouses for great information on the chip industry. One is called SemiWiki, SemiWiki, which has a number of different contributors focusing on different aspects of the chip industry. And then another is semiengineering.com, also has a great set of contributors who work on different parts of the industry. So that's where I would turn if you want really kind of granular, detailed analysis of different facets of the chip industry.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your time this evening and your knowledge. I highly recommend everybody who attends tonight, get yourself a copy at the Chip War. We have the link in the chat to purchase, or you can visit, borrow from the local library. This is a fantastic history. I did not know most of this book. And it's such an important thing to know, especially because the role that it plays not only in our daily lives, but in geopolitical situations too. So Chris, thank you so much for tonight.
Great. Well, thank you, Kelsey, for hosting, and thanks to the audience for tuning in.
All right. Good night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.